Very welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this session on the impact of COVID-19 on SDGs 5, 8, and 12. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce two prominent experts in the field of SDGs and supply chain issues. Ms. Alison Tate, Director of Economic and Social Policy at the International Trade Union Confederation. Most welcome, Alison. Thank you for being here with us today. And Ms. Bharti Patel, a child rights and social justice advocate. She has a vast experience in the UK and in India in leading high-profile research, campaigning, and advocacy organizations. Sustainable development, trafficking prevention, child labor are some of many areas of her expertise. Bharti, most welcome. My name is Parul Sharma, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And before moderating, Alison, I'd like to request you for a 10 minutes reflection from your side on your thoughts on how the pandemic has changed the progress of the SDGs or particular goals of the SDGs.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, although I'm going to be speaking about quite a devastating set of subjects, because if we were not conscious before the pandemic, the world was not on track to meet the implementation of the SDGs before we saw the health and socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19. Clearly, in all countries, here in Europe and across the world, the intersection of these various or lack of investment in sufficient health care to meet the needs of the populations, of crises in economic and employment, in crisis in inequality, and of course also of climate change, the impacts of this for frontline communities and people has been exacerbated. So the deficiencies that people had before the COVID impacts have now meant that both in terms of unemployment, job loss, loss of hours of work, and for businesses and governments also, the lack of programs investing in job creation has had an enormous impact, a devastating impact, in fact. So workers and businesses across global supply chains are really suffering. I want to illustrate this by a few points of evidence. The International Labour Organization, the UN body responsible for the world of work, has estimated that an equivalent of 400 million full-time jobs have already been lost in the first 8 months of the COVID impact in 2020. You can imagine what that might mean for the future. Certainly, women's employment has been at greater risk than men's, particularly owing to the fact that the impact of the downturn in many sectors is where women are disproportionately affected, such as the service sector, so health, care, retail, supermarkets, hospitality, tourism. Workers in low-paid and precarious contracts have been disproportionately affected by job losses, but also they are least likely to have coverage of social protection, despite being the most economically vulnerable. So we now have a world where we are really facing very much in front of us the fact that more than 327 million workers earn at or below a minimum wage in their country. So of this figure, 268 million earn below the minimum wage because of non-compliance, that is, the companies are not paying the wages that are set, or because of the lack of legal coverage. So what we now see is increasing precarity, where informal economy workers, platform economy workers, really with no social protection, with no access to rights in the labor market, and without things like, for example, paid sick leave, has really shown the divisions in our communities and across the world. And in addition, 57 million workers work in countries where there are no minimum wages. That has not existed. So we have a huge challenge from a governance perspective and from fulfilling the intersection of goals, SDG goals 5, 8, and 12. So I'll just take a few more minutes to speak about how also the increased burden of unpaid care brought on by the crisis has affected women more than men. And people on the call will be aware that the realities for women taking care of children, of elderly, of disabled family members, etc., has mostly fallen on the shoulders of women. So this really is a huge impact for those people who are trying to address investment in SDGs. So if we look for a moment at SDG 5 on gender equality, UN Women have the UN agency responsible for addressing discrimination of women and the impacts of that. They've identified that across every sphere, the impact of COVID-19 has exacerbated the difficulties and challenges for women and girls. In terms of labor rights, then, as I've said, women are more engaged in sectors at higher risk in terms of health and safety and loss of income. Some 70% of the global health and social care workforce are women. Women in the informal economy are really in the most vulnerable situations. Women working as domestic workers, as home-based workers, or contributing as family members to businesses. Then the formalization of informal work is a clear strategy that is really necessary to address both SDG 5 and SDG 8. Raising minimum wages, which we can speak about in greater detail, but also strengthening collective bargaining on wages, has shown to be critical for reducing the gender pay gap that exists in all countries at an average of some 17%, and also reducing poverty for women. Raising the minimum wage has been not just important for women in formal work, but also in the informal economy. In regards to SDG 8, inclusive economic growth and decent work, then I'm going to refer to the ITUC global poll in 2020, and also the work that the International Trade Union Confederation has done with our affiliates about looking at SDG 8 measurements and our monitor, which shows that the world of work was not only not on track to be meeting SDG 8, but that in fact the global wages slump before the pandemic showed that 75% of people said that their income had stagnated or fallen behind what they had previously earned. And 1 in 10 say they cannot pay for basic essentials from their income. So people feel a loss of control over their work in terms of hours being demanded of them in excess of agreed hours, and also with the pay differential reducing, then not only is the dignity of work itself being challenged, but also the reality of how we earn our incomes and how livelihoods can actually become thriving livelihoods, which is of course the goal of SDG 8. So vulnerability of workers and violations of fundamental labor rights are actually recorded in all regions of the world, no matter the level of economic growth. And these have been exacerbated since COVID-19 impact. So if I summarize that, we have an increasing precariousness of work and a lack of labor protections. Undermining labor protections should not be used as an outcome of COVID-19. We can see in some cases, companies and governments indeed are undermining those already agreed labor protections, agreed in law and agreed in collective bargaining agreements. So we see low wages, poor health and safety conditions, lack of personal protective equipment, lack of access to paid sick leave, and lack of income support. Despite huge efforts by many governments around the world, even for the short-term arrangements of, say, for example, in Bangladesh, where for 3 months, the Bangladeshi government adjusted the budgetary commitments to be able to support income support for those who'd lost jobs, where actually there had been no floor of social protection before. So we can see where there's been efforts made, but not sufficient and not long-term enough, and not, of course, addressing the exclusion of workers from the coverage of labour law and regulations. I mentioned already informal economy workers and platform workers. So the denial of workers' rights to be represented at work, to join or form a trade union, fundamental human rights, freedom of association and collective bargaining have all suffered as a result of COVID-19. I think that probably gives a picture of the world. But, you know, if we look at where we are not only have lost the capacity to address levels of extreme poverty through wages and social protection and other social programs, we are actually going backwards at a great rate of knots. And this obviously throws up huge challenges for those who are trying to address not just these particular SDGs, but the intersection of these SDGs, which is so important. And so we have a real sense of urgency to address how we can counter those trends and also really build and invest in job creation, in building resilience, as well as the recovery to COVID-19. Happy to answer other questions and follow on.
Yes, absolutely, Alison. And there will be more questions related to your 10 minutes reflection. We'll ask Bharti for your reflection on today's topic, the impact of COVID-19 on SDGs, please.
Thank you so much, Parul, and thank you to CSR Sweden to putting this particular webinar together. I think it's a very important subject, given some of the implications to people, gender equality, inclusive, sustainable development. I think these are issues that we really need to address. Alison's really pulled together some of the important issues around the vulnerability of women, lack of social protection, concerns about collective agreement. So I'm just going to skip over some of that. One thing is clear, there's absolutely no doubt that COVID pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of not just individuals, families, communities, but also companies and vast number of industries. The public sector services are struggling in providing the education, the health and care. And to say that no one was prepared for this pandemic, I think is to understate the scale and the severity with which it has impacted on people's lives and livelihood. I mean, we've seen deaths at unprecedented level, loss of livelihoods, profits in the economy is suffering hugely. And of course, the access to education and health services, particularly of the poor and vulnerable. So this is really, in some ways, going backwards to what the progress was being made. And it is what I think has shown is how interdependent that we are on one another across industries as well as on the public services. And I think employers are beginning to see their interdependency on the groups of people that we're talking about, the people, and also the environment. So for many people, as Alison said, affected currently by COVID, they were already in very poor situations pre-pandemic. So low wages, working conditions was very poor with a very high risk to their health and safety. This was very much the norm. Alison talked about the precarious nature of employment. Many of them wholly dependent, particularly in the kind of poorer countries, on the demand from multinationals for their livelihood. And I'll just talk about that in a second. Migrants, I think we saw pictures of migrants in the way that they were affected, making long journeys away from their home in search of work. With COVID, they've all had to return home with no protection and no opportunities to earn money. We've seen increases in child labor, gender discrimination, and violence against women. So what the last 6 months has done is it has set back countries in terms of their plans and strategies to address poverty, inequality. A few data here. Globally, there are still 168 million children that are engaged in hazardous work. Manufacturing anything from garments, carpets, toys, jewelry, and the production of numerous agriculture products, fruit, vegetables, cocoa, coffee, and cotton. We've read numerous reports on how children are exploited and abused in this industries. And COVID has done is posed the multiple challenges for governments, industries, as well as workers themselves. And I think what we need, and Alison mentioned that, is that there is a need for the corporate leaders and government to rise to the challenges that we are facing. To do nothing is no longer an option. I think everyone needs to take action. To quote one of the prominent business leaders and a philanthropist in India, Ratan Tata, he said, laying off people will not solve your problem, as you have a responsibility towards your employees. I thought that was quite a powerful statement. Followed within that statement was a statement made by UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and I'd just like to quote that. He said, there will be many, many job losses, and that is just inevitable. So you can see the industrialists actually talking about, let's not lay off workers. And you've got the Prime Minister of the UK saying, actually, you know what? Unemployment is going to happen. Job losses is inevitable. And I believe that's really an irresponsible statement that he made. It threw out, almost like throwing in the towel. At a time when workers and businesses feel most insecure and they would look to government for support. One of the reports said in the UK, 5.866 million small and medium enterprises are in precarious position right now. They have said that something like 1.6 million UK jobs are put at risk unless measures are urgently taken to protect their businesses. So that's the kind of picture as to what's happening. On gender equality and gender-based violence, the SDG 5, these problems already existed. We know that, according to the World Health Organization, 1 in 3 women are exposed to experience violence in their lifetime. It was gaining momentum and recognizing that gender equality is a fundamental human right, and that empowering women spurs production and economic growth, and that economic independence is critical to women's empowerment. But as Alison pointed out, many of these women work in low-paid jobs with very little progress in their career, and often stuck in that area. What COVID-19 has shown again is that the vulnerable industries have started to take what I call knee-jerk reactions. The fashion industry, which is dependent, particularly in the countries, in the low-income countries, on cheap labor of women and children. Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Myanmar, India, they're all kind of in that situation. Lockdown has significantly reduced the consumption. Now, one could say this is a good sign because we know increasing consumption has had negative impacts on the environment. But what's happened as a result of that reduction in consumption is that the immediate reaction by some of the multinationals was to minimize their losses by shifting the financial burden to the bottom of the supply chains. And that is often women working in the smaller enterprises. They've cancelled orders, they've pulled out of their procurement and production contracts at very short notice, and there's been non-payment or delayed payments for completed orders. The consequences of this is felt not just by the smaller supply chain production companies, but also mostly by vulnerable women who were asked to leave. Hundreds of garment workers were laid off, and with no payment, no security for the future in employment practices. So making a shift to change requires a rethink of the economic model and the strategy which does not leave the most vulnerable in further distress in situations like this. So I've got some kind of solutions, which really includes, as far as Goal 5 is concerned, to adopt a gender equality plan. To do this collectively with trade unions, at the top level of the company with external partners, positively promoting equality and diversity and fostering those policies that better reflect people's needs. I think you need community buy-in. Community need to be very much aware that that gender discrimination, that violence against women is an important, it's a problem. It happens within the community. So we need a buy-in about empowering women on this from the community. And also, I believe corporates can use their leverage to increase the political will and enforce the laws on this. Going to touch a little bit on the goal 12, because I think this is going to be a challenge for the corporate sector in particular and the government, because the current meta and microeconomic and business model is built on and dependent on increasing consumption. We see signs of offers of buy one, get one free. Fast fashion, disposable and non-recyclable products have become the norm as far as consumer is concerned. Increase your supply at low cost and high profits and see the demand grow is often the motto of some of the big multinationals, and also the government, by attracting foreign direct investment on the basis that they are offering the lowest labor costs in those countries. So I believe there's never been a better time than now for companies and the public sector to revisit their business model and assess sustainability of their procurement of goods and services. There is a growing appetite amongst consumers for safe and sustainable products and services that are free from abuse and exploitation. There is a distinct, I think, behavior change as far as consumerism is concerned. And corporates will have to shape that consumer decisions, move away from the rapid and irresponsible consumption that I believe both the corporate are pushing, as well as the demand is coming from the consumers. One of the things I've read recently is that business models need to now think very quickly, urgently, how to reuse the clothes that they have made, how to recycle materials and maximize the kind of life cycle of the work that they're doing, and at the same time respect the rights of the citizens. There is, as I said, appetite for it, and all of us are now looking at reusing some of the clothes and not throwing away what we purchase. I think there are solutions. I think they've always been there. I think the SDG offers a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. The goals that we're discussing are a very important part of it. Companies need to work collectively with the broad range of organizations and institutions. Trade unions play an important role. NGOs play an important role. One of the things I think the companies need to do is put in place a due diligence process, but also look at the root causes, analyze the broader ecosystem as to where they are working, understand the knowledge on the causes and the systemic failures. And I think they can use their leverage to work with the government to ensure that the laws and policies and practices are fit for sustainable development and they are not based on exploitative measures. They need to be transparent. I think this is where what we've seen in the UK and in Australia and many other countries are now coming on board. As part of the Modern Slavery Act, the larger companies are required to disclose what steps they are taking to ensure that slavery, human trafficking is not happening in their operations direct as well as through their supply chains. However, there are no direct penalties if businesses don't take any steps. And here lies the problem. If there isn't a penalty, businesses will carry on business as usual. So I think, again, the governments need to think about how to make sure that businesses are held to account for human rights abuses. One thing that's missing is training for across the personnel of the company, making sure that staff as well as their procurement personnel, workers, are trained on what human rights have, what human rights is, are trained on what companies' due diligence process is, making sure that they have an input in that process. And I think this applies not just the clothing industry, but it applies to across all the industries. There is a need to change. I'm going to end this with what companies have to do, and that's talking about fiscal measures. This is tax being paid. What companies must do is that they must pay a fair amount of tax in the countries where they generate their income and profits. Governments in some of the poorer countries are struggling to support and to fund some of the fundamental public services, education, health, water, sanitation, shelter. I can go on. ActionAid's recent research, I think, speaks volumes on what's happening. They said big companies, particularly technology companies in the US of A, are exploiting loopholes in global tax rules, and they have avoided paying as much as $2.8 billion a year in developing countries. This is denying the poor access to those kind of services that they need. So I think expansion of public services can happen with contribution from the private sector. If they are being attracted to countries where the cost is low, they should ensure that at the very least they are paying a fair tax. To help build the social protection system, how vital that is, I think Alison touched on that. To support the public services, ensure that living wages is being paid, and strengthen workers' rights. I'm happy to take questions on that kind of broader picture of what.
Right. Thank you very, very much, Bharati. I'll come back to your reflection in a moment. Firstly, I'd like to just relate to what Alison, you said that. Well, first of all, thank you both for presenting this very gloomy picture. It is indeed a gloomy picture. We are facing quite many challenges. But let's now step into practically what kind of policies we are looking at, which are could be seen as fairly strict for companies and corporations and governments, for that matter. But you touched upon some practical aspects for companies to think about, or rather at a macro level. But Alison, I just want to ask you, you mentioned that this is affecting all regions of the world. What do we gather from the unions, trade unions work here? How active have they been? Because when COVID-19 happened, when it was a clear reality for all of us, there was a rather fast definition of non-essential and essential workers. And was the trade union even involved in this process globally?
Sure. The language of essential and non-essential workers is language I would challenge, because if you've got a job, it's an essential job. And if we're not going to be respecting the dignity of that, sometimes, when I speak to garbage collectors or waste management workers, they say that their work is often not recognized. But now, as a result of COVID-19, the management of waste and the removal of waste is now seen as not just an essential job, but an essential service in our society. So whilst it might not be the best paid, and in fact what we see is many people working in jobs that we now see are essential to the functioning of our societies, to the economic progress of our societies, then I think it's important to say it's not about essential services or work or not, but essential supply chains. So very often, essential supply chains are about health, medical equipment, medicines, of course, food, and that includes farmers through to supermarket workers, the transport and logistics workers. There are many jobs that are now, as a result of the visibility of COVID-19 and of the disruption of many of those jobs and supply chains, people now understand them to be essential. So from that perspective, I would then address the fact that indeed global supply chains have been hugely impacted, not only in terms of the production venues where goods or services are produced, how they are transported, how they get to market, how they are then distributed, but likewise the relationship between some of the biggest multinationals in the world and across supply chains from tier 1 right through to home-based workers has actually been massively disrupted. Now, we can look at this as a devastating development because as the impact on real people's lives and the pace within which we have to address those disruptions is actually a huge challenge globally. But we also need to look at where now those relationships mean that future investments, current and future investments, need to go to ensure both an economy that is one built on resilience and that can help the globe recover rather than business as usual. And this is actually where we bring in the investment in the SDGs and the linkages between the SDGs. But I would really say that the way in which companies source is now being questioned at headquarters level, across their procurement teams, across their pricing teams, and into where manufacturers are able to continue to produce, or where because of the COVID impact, shutdowns have occurred, not only in the retail sector, but in the production and the distribution of inputs to business. Then there's been a lot more rethinking about what that requires in terms of business continuity and the responsibilities of all actors in that, not only to support the safety of workers in production lines or in factories or on farms, but indeed for businesses to take a view of the risk that they face. And this, I think, brings us into the conversation about really assessing what risk is in the business model that exists, and happy to speak much more about that.
Thank you very much, Alison. There is a question from the audience on if you can elaborate a bit on basic income, both of you, maybe. There is a lot of discussion on the value of basic income in many countries today. Is it going to happen? Is it even possible? Bharti, would you like to say something on that? And then maybe Alison. Bharti, your mic is off. Mic is still off, Bharti.
Okay, that should be on. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The universal basic income debate has been with us for a very, very long time. And there are advantages and the disadvantages to this, but if it's part of a social protection system, as opposed to be a minimum level of basic income that people should have, what level would it be set at? I think those are important issues. If we're talking about a global basic income, then we need to consider also the kind of individual countries' situation, abilities, the kind of levels of poverty that exist at different levels, and whether the basic income is going to be nothing but the first platform. And from that, we need to be considering increasing that and making sure that families and individuals are able to negotiate and leverage the basic income to increase their income. So being very careful that it doesn't become a maximum level, that it should be seen as a very, very minimum level. So I think, yeah, it needs further discussion. We need some economic analysis of this and what it would mean to workers as well as to the government.
Right. Alison, over to you. Basic income. It's been going on forever, the discussion. Is it going to happen? Could it happen?
Well, in some places, it's being spoken of as a basic income. For example, in Spain. However, I would say that if addressing a basic income is all that we win out of really addressing the huge deficits that our global economic system offers, well, it would meet the immediate needs. And I'm not saying those immediate needs are not necessary or important. They're fundamentally and urgently required. But that is when we're looking at a situation where a fundamental social protection floor does not exist. I gave the example earlier of Bangladesh. What we need to do is really use this opportunity, and governments have a huge responsibility here both in their own responsibilities of labour market institutions and the way in which labour is treated in their countries, but also from a donor government perspective in terms of development partnership, then really addressing the deficiencies where someone can lose their job and have no social protection, access to no support, which essentially means starvation. And sadly, devastatingly, that is the case in some countries. People will die of starvation before they die of COVID-19.
Yeah.
This is the face of reality of poverty in many countries around the world. So I would suggest it's not a point about whether immediate cash transfers are available. That is a responsibility for governments, and indeed some of the international financial institutions like the World Bank have been in action on that. But it's not enough, and it's certainly not sufficient to guarantee dignity or resilience. And it's certainly not enough to guarantee that countries have the capacity to respond. But we just really do not have a system in many countries that addresses fundamental social protections as a human security matter. So whilst an income replacement in the first instance is really important, what we need to be doing is investing in the longer term sustainable social protection system. That also is a fundamental human right. And companies, of course, have a responsibility to pay for those provisions of social protection as well as wages. And indeed, I would say sick pay to actually, if that's not a lesson learned out of this process, then we are really blind.
Right. May I ask, Alison, the role of public procurement in this? I read somewhere that the richest countries in the world, the OECD countries, have a public procurement matching 12% of these richest countries' GDP. So this, I can't even imagine the amount of money we are talking about here. But how could public procurement help in strengthening labor standards? And what kind of a tool, an instrument for betterment could public procurement become post-COVID-19?
Yeah, I think you're jumping ahead of where most governments are, Parul, and that's a good thing. The reality is that many governments are still looking at what their income support measures are and how they will fund those. And the points made earlier about taxation and having the fiscal space for governments to ensure that that is sufficient and is implemented long in developed and developing countries, I might add, across Europe as well. But in the context of the pandemic, governments could use public procurement to contribute to recovery and resilience. For example, they could use public procurement as a tool, as you say, to create new production in personal protective equipment. There's a lot of talk about global supply chains being reshored, coming back onshore, moving back from countries like China and developing countries where many goods and services have been outsourced because of the lack of employment protections in those countries. It's a very, the notion of race to the bottom has to be addressed here. So are we really willing to look at the investment in creating jobs, in compensating for job losses elsewhere? That can be done both in terms of developing and developed countries to really look at the economic diversification of local economies, but ensuring at the same time that those jobs that are created are decent jobs that meet the social criteria that we speak of when we speak of the goals we're discussing today. But requiring that within a bidder's procurement process is really important to respect human and workers' rights, to promote environmentally friendly production, as we were just speaking about, to include high environmental standards that are actually going to address the climate crisis that we have, and indeed the race to the bottom in terms of production methods that have been used for decades. So I would say it has a hugely important role to both formalize the informal economy, to diversify the economy, and to respect human and workers' rights.
Right. Thank you very much, Alison. Bharti, you've worked quite actively on the UK Modern Slavery Act. You were part of the formation of the Act as well. Now, we read very sort of gloomy reports on the status of, or the increase of modern slavery due to COVID-19. Would you like to elaborate some of that, and what do you think companies purchasing from high-risk countries, how should they think now at this stage?
Yeah, Parul, as you know, when we were lobbying the UK government for decent measures in the Modern Slavery Act, making sure that those that are trafficked, those that are enslaved in forced labor, children working in hazardous condition, it was important that there were protection measures, quite strong protection measures. But what we wanted to do also is to make sure that governments looked at how such kind of abuse, modern slavery, trafficking can be prevented in the first instance. And one of the things that I was highlighting was the fact that huge amount of profit was being made by companies in the richer countries at the cost of the country, the workers in the low-income countries. And so we wanted to look at whether there was the whole kind of idea about not just protecting victims of modern slavery and trafficking, but making sure that there were concerns about how employers and how companies were behaving in some of these countries. And so looking at the procurement practices, as you talked about, and we now have that very clearly outlined in the Modern Slavery Act, the transparency in supply chains. It is, I think, a strong tool if it was adequately enforced and if there was a mandatory requirement for companies to go beyond just looking at what's happening in their supply chains, but to actually talk about what corrective actions they are going to take if they find modern slavery, incidences of modern slavery in their supply chains. And as Alison said, we need to go beyond the tier one. It really needs, and so the company needs to understand the ecosystem, the environment of the country that they are investing in. And I think this is vital. So don't just look at assessing risks for your business, but actually look at assessing risks for the people that are in the countries that you're investing in. And so have a much more of a human rights approach to this, rather than just a kind of, reputational damage to your company, which is what I think a lot of companies are concerned about. So the government of the UK is, if you like, pushing their kind of, flagship on being one of the first country to have put together a Modern Slavery Act. I think other countries can learn not just from this, but also the mistakes and the lacunas, the gaps in our Modern Slavery Act, and make sure that the corporate sector actually has a key role to play in stopping, in preventing, and ensuring that people workers are protected, but also ensuring that, and Alison talked about that there is support systems in the country. Social protection is vital to this. It's the vulnerability of the workers, of not having access to adequate protection that then pushes them into exploitative situations. So we need to be addressing the root causes rather than just looking at post-abuse, post-exploitation, post-modern slavery.
Thank you very much, Bharti. Alison, there is a lot of discussion going on human rights due diligence within Europe at the moment. And we are seeing the possibility of the European Union member states going for legislation, national legislations now on human rights due diligence. What advice would you like to give companies who are now hopefully in preparation and preparing themselves to adapt to a forthcoming human rights due diligence legislation? and keeping a post-COVID situation in mind?
I think those companies that see themselves as front runners or first movers, as often it's stated, will find themselves in a, they will have a competitive advantage actually over other companies in Europe or indeed elsewhere in the world. There is a lot of concern, I think, in the business community at the moment about what due diligence really requires. But actually doing that now and preparing for that before the regulations come in is actually going to be an advantage to those companies. Why I say that is many companies that I've spoken with about how they've managed the COVID impact across their supply chains have said that it's because of their social auditing or their knowledge of how suppliers have responded. It's how they've been able to address concerns in the past where there's been violations of workers' rights, labor rights, that they have known both their suppliers much better and also the potential risks much better. So what the mandatory due diligence framing is all about, it's not about making companies exposed in a scandal to be, shown up and finally get on with cleaning up your act. No, this is about being proactive and having a really sustainable business model, economically sustainable in terms of the impact of ecological and social and governance concerns. And investors are engaging with many big companies right now. It's many of the smaller companies across the supply chain that are wondering how they can ensure, not just from a compliance perspective, but from a responsible business perspective, how they can ensure that they can deal with the risks that they find. And that is, from a trade union perspective, the most important element, to be able to identify what risks exist and then put in place a program to address those risks. And that will actually be a very worthwhile investment for businesses who are looking at not only their own headquarters or main operations, but diligence accountabilities, then understanding and knowing how to develop those systems with stakeholders, and trade unions are one of those stakeholders, is really essential.
Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you very much. Bharti, how should corporations actually focus now on Goal 5 in your view? Generally, and if you could probably give some sector-wise advice.
Yeah, I think the focus really should be acknowledging and accepting the value that women bring to their business. Alison talked about key workers, essential workers. Many of the women working in the sectors that we're talking about, manufacturing as well as service sector, are extremely undervalued. It's a very clear, low wages, poor conditions of employment. And so start with valuing it. Have a very, very clear gender equality action plan so that it's seen as to how employers are acting, what actions they're taking, and a time plan to be able to then to make sure that there is no discrimination in the workplace. And I think, again, they can work with trade unions to do that. On the positive side of it, in the UK, because of the COVID, what we've seen is trade unions and businesses are coming together. We've seen increasing numbers of members that are becoming, workers that are joining trade unions. And we are seeing corporates collaborating with the unions to seek support from the government. I think this needs to be built on. And given the strength of the trade unions on gender rights, on equality, trade unions can actually bring a lot to corporates thinking on this. I would like to see that. What I'd also like to see is the voice of women into the boardrooms, just so that there is an understanding of what is discriminating women. Where are the policies and practices needed in order to not just empower women, but make sure that they play a critical role. And I think if that happens, I believe businesses will see a real change in the way that they operate, in the models that they deploy. And I believe it can be quite sustainable and allow them to reach the goals that they want to. So just have a very, very gender focus on this.
Right.
Approach this with the focus of gender.
Right. Thank you, Bharti. Alison, in my work, in my line of advisory towards companies, many companies face a difficulty in having proper gender equality measurements for the supply chain. And they also feel that there is a lack of support from the trade unions. Is that a correct reading from these companies? Is there a lack of support when we talk about supply chain aspects today? Is that maybe something where even trade unions should become stronger in a field where they should strengthen themselves?
As a feminist economist, I would, of course, say, yes, trade unions need to strengthen their work in regards to addressing gender discrimination, indeed gender-based violence, and all the issues that ensure that women are still very much second-class citizens in many workplaces.
Right.
So, of course, there's a lot of work for unions to do. I can tell you that the leadership of the unions is absolutely committed to that. We have indeed a commitment to addressing gender discrimination at all levels, at workplace level, at industry level, within our own structures, and of course in terms of government policy. But I would say that it's not necessarily that women don't have a space to take up these issues themselves. It's rather that many processes exclude women, even when it's negotiations between trade unions and management. And I think that part of the opportunities of due diligence processes is to actually look at not just the way in which trade unions are engaged in assessing risk, but in solving those solutions and coming to address the most fundamental risks in workplaces and in industries and in particular countries. So here we have a huge opportunity to ensure that women are not only represented, but that women's issues are taken seriously, both in terms of collective bargaining provisions, but also, I don't know if I'm freezing there. It seems like...
I hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, that women's issues are taken seriously in negotiations, in the outcomes of those negotiations, and that women's voices are not just seen as something that's a nice indicator to tick a box in a social auditing program, rather that women's voices from the workplace through to management at all levels are taken seriously and make the difference that we're committed to.
Yeah,
exactly, and I agree very much with you, Alison. I think what the reaction has been like is that when you talk about gender equality policies and methods, it sort of gets stuck at the first tier level. It never put down in the supply chain. So I think that has been a massive reaction from many of my clients, at least. But what you're saying is very powerful. We must get at least women around the negotiation table to start with, so that that perspective at least gets established very much. Now, I'd like both of you to give one hands-on tip or advice to the people listening, both from the state government side and from the private sector side. What should the preparedness generally be? Because we are going to, hopefully very soon, enter a post-COVID situation. How should they strengthen themselves, and what should their preparedness be? Who would like to start?
I can go first. I think it's something I've mentioned already, so I'm just going to stress that. I think corporates need to make sure that if they are going to invest in some of the lower income countries, really in order to increase their market, then they need to consider what is it that they are going to give back to those countries that they're investing in. And the giving back for me is it's some of the fiscal measures, making sure that they are paying the tax that's due, making sure that they're investing in not just in their businesses and in their workers, but also in the broader ecosystem. For me, that's good. Use their leverage to work with governments and trade unions here, as well as the NGO sector, to put into place these very basic and fundamental rights of workers, social security system. So I think it's really very much about just working collaboratively, just putting in place the protection measures, ensuring that human rights of men, women, and children are respected in everything that happens in their operations and across their supply chains.
Thank you, Bharti. Alison?
I think this is a really important moment to be addressing the realities of the world. So rather than pasting over a very broken system, it's an opportunity for corporations to really look at who their key stakeholders are. And obviously the workforce is a part of that. I would say that looking at the kind of business that business owners and managers and other actors want to be, is the absolute measure of profitability or of impact for a business. So there are so many more other aspects that need to be taken seriously for a company to be acting in a responsible way. And, you know, that's laid out in the OECD guidelines, for example, the guidance on responsible business conduct. It's not reinventing a wheel or trying to come up with new measures. It's actually about doing the very fundamental work of engaging with social partners. So businesses and unions in many countries are understood to be in social partnership, but often that partnership has not really delivered the potential that we want. And if we really look at the crisis that we're facing, the economic and employment and climate crisis, then here is an opportunity to be looking at what kind of jobs are created, where there's investment in decent job creation, but also under what sort of terms and conditions those jobs are, to actually ensure that investing in skills and skills enhancement, this is the transition that is needed in all countries, no matter the level of industrial development. Right. We see that investing in climate-friendly jobs, in reducing carbon emissions, in transferring to really making the most benefit from technological deployment. And for that not just to be a jobs poor environment where job creation is not an element of that, but rather profits are the primary consideration. Of course, profits are important. And of course, a sustainable business requires good profit making, but not to the destruction of the social relationships, the social contract, and the planet. So I would say that here we have an opportunity to really look at engaging in social partnership, ensuring that the knowledge and skills and innovation from the work floor through to the boards of companies is really maximized. And here we have a huge opportunity. So I would just really say to the companies that are engaging in this webinar that the trade union movement stands ready to ensure that not just decent jobs and safe jobs and clean jobs are the future, but that we really set that foundation now for the investments being made now for the benefit of future generations.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much, both of you. Bharti Patel, Child Rights and Social Justice Advocate, Alison Tate, Director of Economic Social Policy at the International Trade Union Confederation, Many, many thanks. I am 100% sure that our listeners and the audience have picked up some really powerful advice from both of you, but also great knowledge about the whereabouts of our globe and our world, and especially those who are most marginalized. We need to prepare ourselves and really make sure that we take this period of time, a very difficult period of time, as an opportunity to strengthen our work for sustainable supply chains. And Bharti, you have underlined it several times, and Alison, even you have said it. We must think about the overall climate perspective of where these workers and these children are producing our products, and learn more about the markets where we put our production lines. Friends, we are now running out of time, but I'm ever so grateful to both Alison and Bharti once again. Thank you, CSR Europe. Thank you, CSR Sweden, for this opportunity. And thank you all listeners. And Bharti and Alison, I hope to meet you again. I admire both of you a lot. You are massive knowledge banks, whom I look to whenever I seek new information and knowledge of what is going on. So thank you once again very much. Friends, all the listeners, take good care of yourself. Think about distancing yourself, not socially, but physically. Wash your hands, use face masks, just take care of yourself. But be responsible and be responsible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paro.